The sterile quiet of a suburban hospital room should have been a sanctuary. For the young mother, it was a moment of profound vulnerability, shattered instantly by the arrival of the city's most dominant crime boss, the volatile father of her newborn. In a callous act of rage, he strikes her while she is weakest. This unforgivable transgression, violence committed just steps from a bassinet, immediately reaches the ears of her powerful father, a man whose quiet influence masked a terrifying capacity for retribution. There are no truce negotiations, only an immediate, visceral declaration of total war against the entire syndicate. The attack transforms a private violation into a public and bloody conflict, destroying any chance of peace. The air in the private recovery suite of St. Jude's Mercy Hospital was thick with the faint smell of disinfectant and stale floral arrangement water. Outside the window, the oppressive heat of summer 2024 shimmered over the metropolitan sprawl, but inside, the chill of over-cranked air conditioning permeated the space. Evelyn Evie Harper, 24, lay propped up against a stack of crisp white pillows. Her pale complexion and slight build were accentuated by the clinical white sheets, making the deep exhaustion visible in the bruised shadows beneath her eyes. Just 36 hours earlier, she had navigated a traumatic labor and delivery, and now the profound physical vulnerability left her feeling exposed, despite the locked door and the quiet hum of the monitoring equipment. The quiet was a deception. It promised safety where none truly existed. The electronic lock on the door clicked, a sharp, invasive sound that cut through the silence. Evie's breath hitched. Only specific staff and one family member had the code. She knew instinctively, sickeningly, who ignored the rules. The door swung inward with deliberate slowness, revealing Salvatore Sal Messina, 38. His muscular, imposing stature seemed to fill the room, pushing the sterile, innocent air out. He wore a custom-tailored linen suit, an odd choice for a hospital visit, accented by heavy gold jewelry that caught the weak afternoon light. Sal exuded volatility and arrogant ruthlessness, a man accustomed to taking whatever space and whoever he desired. He didn't look at the baby. His eyes, dark and possessive, were fixed solely on Evie. "Evelyn," he greeted, his voice low, a gravelly sound that always carried the faint threat of impact. Evie shrank slightly into the mattress. "What are you doing here, Sal?" Her voice was a dry whisper. He took 2 steps, closing the distance to the foot of the bed. The scent of expensive cologne and gunpowder, or something close enough to it, wafted over her. "I'm here to see my son," he corrected, though he still hadn't glanced at the bassinet, "and to finalize our arrangement." A slow, chilling smile spread across Sal's face. It was the smile of a predator realizing its prey was trapped. Terms change, Karina, especially when leverage is involved. He leaned forward, placing his hands on the footrail. The gesture was casual, yet the sheer force of his presence felt like physical weight pressing down on her lungs. "You thought you could birth a successor to the Moretti Messina name and keep him hidden with your quaint little father," Sal scoffed, dismissing the very notion. "You belong to me, Evelyn, and everything you create belongs to me too. I am nothing to you now, Salvatore." "We were over before I knew about the baby." His eyes narrowed, the arrogance curdling into rage. "You dare stand in my house, in my city, and tell me where your loyalties lie? This isn't your house. This is St. Jude's Mercy Hospital. It's supposed to be safe." "Safety is a fantasy for people like you, Evelyn, especially when you try to deny me." "You leave me," he snarled, his face inches from hers. "You run to that old man and you think I won't make you understand the consequence?" He didn't release her arm. Instead, he raised his free hand. Evie squeezed her eyes shut, bracing herself, the terror overwhelming the exhaustion. The smack was loud, dull, and cold. It wasn't a flailing punch of uncontrolled emotion. It was a measured, calculated strike, designed to inflict pain and humiliation in equal measure right across her recovering cheek. The ringing silence that followed was broken only by the whimpering sound Evie couldn't suppress, and the faint, unsettling gurgle of the baby in the bassinet, momentarily stirred by the shockwave. Salvatore Messina stood back, straightening his suit cuffs as if he'd just dusted lint off his shoulder. His expression was utterly devoid of remorse, replaced instead by grim satisfaction. "That," he stated, his voice now calm and definitive, "is a reminder. You call your father. You tell him the terms are non-negotiable, or the next time, I take the child, and you spend the rest of your life wondering where he is." He cast a quick, dismissive look at the sleeping infant, then turned and walked out, leaving the door slightly ajar, a violation of the promise of privacy. 2 hours later, 80 miles away, the report landed like a catastrophic meteor on the desk of Arthur J. Callahan, 55. Arthur Callahan was not the type of man who shouted or threw objects. His salt and pepper hair was perfectly combed, his tailored suit impeccable even late in the day, and his piercing blue eyes were usually calm, reflecting meticulous planning and immense self-control. He was a man whose quiet influence and sophisticated network masked an unwavering, almost pathological capacity for retribution. He was currently at the old Hawthorne estate, a sprawling, secluded mansion that looked, to the untrained eye, like the retirement home of a successful industrialist. In reality, it was the nerve center of his operations that were usually confined to high-level finance, political leverage, and the strategic avoidance of conflict. His lieutenant, a grim-faced man named Harris, delivered the information in low, clipped tones, recounting the nurse's panicked call, the hospital security report, and Evie's own tear-choked confession. As Harris spoke the precise words, "Messina hit her, Mr. Callahan, in the recovery room, left a mark." Arthur's composure fractured, not explosively, but internally, like rock subjected to crushing pressure. Arthur J. Callahan listened, head slightly tilted, utterly motionless. When Harris finished, the silence was profound. Arthur did not react with immediate visceral rage. Instead, his entire being seemed to retract, the piercing blue eyes losing focus as he processed the unforgivable equation. His daughter, his only child, recovering from the immense physical trauma of childbirth, was struck by a brute, a thug who mistakenly believed his criminal enterprise superseded fundamental human decency and familial honor. This was not a business dispute. This was a violation of the highest order, committed in a place of sanctity, just steps from his grandchild. It wasn't just an assault, it was a fundamental challenge to Arthur's authority, a declaration that Messina held no respect for the boundary that had long kept their worlds merely parallel. Arthur stood up, moving with a chilling, deliberate grace. He walked past Harris, ignoring the concern etched on the younger man's face, and entered his private study, a room lined floor to ceiling with rare books and dominated by a heavy mahogany desk. He moved directly to a hidden safe, built into the wall behind a false shelf of first editions. The mechanism required a retinal scan and a 6-digit rotating code. When the heavy steel door swung open, the light revealed not weapons or cash, but 2 objects, a slim, leather-bound book and a specialized piece of communication equipment. He retrieved the Callahan ledger. It wasn't a standard accounting record, it was a detailed log of every deep asset, every long-dormant contact, every favor owed, and every pre-planned operational contingency Arthur had ever established. This ledger represented 30 years of quiet, sophisticated influence, all waiting for the moment of catastrophic need. He placed the ledger on the desk, flipping immediately to the chapter marked Contingency Red, Total Systemic Retribution. Next, he took the second item, the encrypted satellite phone. It was bulky, old-school military grade, and utterly untraceable. Harris watched from the doorway as Arthur, the sophisticated magnate, transformed seamlessly into the conductor of annihilation. Arthur pressed a sequence of buttons, the phone chirping faintly. The time on the device was synchronized to global operational standards, not local time. He waited 3 rings before a synthesized voice answered. "Valkyrie Command," the voice stated flatly. Arthur leaned into the receiver, his voice cold, level, stripped of all emotion except absolute finality. "This is Red King. Execute Protocol Hydra. Target is the Messina Syndicate. Effective immediately." There was a moment of silence on the line, a hesitation that suggested the enormity of the command. Protocol Hydra was the designation for the systematic, synchronized liquidation of an entire operational network. "Red King, confirm. Authorization level, total war," Arthur declared, "against the entire syndicate. 0 tolerance, no retreat, no survivors." He ended the call, the click echoing in the opulent study. The declaration was complete. Arthur Callahan did not seek negotiation or measured revenge. He demanded extinction. He looked at Harris, who stood rigid in the doorway, understanding the seismic shift that had just occurred. "Pull up the logistical maps for the ironclad district," Arthur commanded, already opening the Callahan ledger to cross-reference key operational locations. "Identify all primary money laundering facilities, enforcement strongholds, and communications hubs belonging to Messina." "We hit them all simultaneously. Mr. Callahan, Hydra requires significant resources." "Are you sure?" "I am sure, Harris," Arthur cut him off, the look in his eye promising severe consequences for any further doubt. "That man struck my daughter in her weakest moment, next to my grandson. He violated the sanctity of my family. He has invited chaos. We will deliver devastation. I want their infrastructure erased before the sun sets tomorrow." The conflict erupted not with a public car bomb or a splashy headline assassination, but with a series of coordinated surgical strikes characterized by Arthur Callahan's meticulous planning. The ironclad district was the gritty, industrial heart of the Messina Syndicate's operations. It was a maze of dilapidated warehouses, hidden docks, and densely populated residential zones favored by their enforcement teams. It was heavily fortified, built to withstand local law enforcement, but not a coordinated military-style siege. As midnight approached, the city was rocked by the systematic liquidation of Messina's infrastructure. The first strike targeted the primary ledger house, a reinforced structure disguised as a frozen goods distributor. Two teams, operating independently, used precision thermal charges to breach the vault walls. They didn't steal the money. They vaporized the digital records and key hardware, turning decades of financial structure into slag and ash. This attack was led not by traditional mobsters, but by silent, highly trained operatives, men who Arthur had retained over the years from specialized security contracting firms, men who viewed this operation as strictly business, adhering to the mission parameters detailed in the Callahan ledger. Salvatore Messina, who had returned to his fortified compound in the ironclad district, feeling supremely confident after his display of dominance at St. Jude's, was initially confused. The silence was unnerving. His field lieutenants couldn't reach him. His primary communication line was static. "What the hell is happening?" Sal roared into a dead phone, pacing his elaborate, ugly office, all marble, dark wood, and bad taste. "Why is Rico's line dead? Get someone down to the warehouse now." The response was delayed, then catastrophic. One of his bodyguards burst in, face slick with panic. "Boss, the docks, they're gone. The entire B-wing is on fire, and the transport manifests. They're all destroyed." Sal felt a spike of genuine, icy fear. This wasn't local turf war. Local rivals stole cargo. They didn't erase evidence and infrastructure with this level of clinical precision. Who did this? The feds? No, boss. Too clean. Too fast. And the men who responded, they didn't see anyone. Just smoke and specialized explosives. This is military grade. Sal finally realized the true gravity of his actions in the hospital room. He hadn't just struck Evie. He had inadvertently activated something primal and devastating. Arthur Callahan's paternal rage, channeled through years of untouchable wealth and influence. He had declared war on a ghost, a man whose capabilities he had fatally underestimated. Arthur, meanwhile, watched the initial phase unfold from the old Hawthorne estate, surrounded by monitors and maps that glowed eerily in the study's darkness. He wore reading glasses now, his focus unwavering. He was not motivated by profit or expansion. He was motivated solely by the immediate eradication of the threat to his lineage. Phase 2 activation, Arthur instructed Harris, pointing to a section of the ironclad map. The enforcement compounds. Switch from liquidation to neutralization. I want Messina's ability to defend himself completely degraded. Phase 2 was less subtle. It targeted the human element. The teams moved in swift, small units, utilizing coordinated diversions and overwhelming force. They didn't seek protracted gun battles. They utilized flashbangs, tear gas, and non-lethal incapacitation designed to disarm and disorient, allowing Arthur's people to secure vast caches of Messina's weapons and high-value personnel quickly. The police, mysteriously slow to respond in the ironclad district, were overwhelmed by the sheer sudden scale of the conflict, reporting dozens of localized riots and industrial accidents. As the systematic destruction continued into the next day, Salvatore Messina realized he was cornered. His money was frozen or incinerated, his command structure was non-existent, and his operational base was crumbling around him. Arthur Callahan hadn't simply retaliated. He had suffocated the entire syndicate in a synchronized pincer movement. Sal retreated to his personal strongroom, a bunker within the ironclad district compound, gathering his last, most loyal enforcers, a group of perhaps a dozen men. He was arrogant, yes, but also deeply possessive. He knew Arthur Callahan would eventually come for him, and he intended to take a major asset with him, the newborn child. He wants war, he gets war, Sal spat, wiping sweat from his brow. We pull out of the district, circle back to St. Jude's. We take the kid, use him as our shield. Callahan won't touch us if we have his grandson. It was a desperate, panicked plan, fueled by the delusion that Arthur Callahan, having declared total war, would suddenly revert to measured negotiation. The moment Sal and his remaining men emerged from the compound, they found the exit routes blocked. Arthur's planning had anticipated this exact route of retreat. This was the definitive bloody confrontation. Arthur had not hired professional killers for this final stage. He had activated the few, select men he considered family, those who held absolute loyalty to him, and understood the meaning of the word honor that Sal had violated. The confrontation was brutal and swift. It took place in a narrow, oily alleyway deep within the ironclad district. Messina's men, armed with automatic weapons, were unprepared for the disciplined, calculated attack. Arthur's forces moved like a single, unbreakable unit. Salvatore Messina fought with the wild abandon of a trapped animal. He managed to down 2 of Arthur's perimeter men before he was flanked. The final standoff occurred beneath a rusting fire escape, the smell of diesel and smoke heavy in the air. Sal was bleeding from a graze wound, his expensive suit ripped and stained. He was down to his last clip, his eyes blazing with hatred and terror. "Callahan!" Sal screamed into the darkness, knowing Arthur was nearby, orchestrating the final blows. "You ruined everything! You think you can just erase me!" Callahan emerged from the shadows of a defunct loading dock, flanked by Harris and 2 security specialists. He held no weapon. He didn't need one. "You declared war, Salvatore," Arthur stated, his voice carrying clearly over the fading sounds of battle. "I merely accepted the terms. The girl, she was nothing. She was leverage," Sal yelled, waving his pistol wildly. "I just wanted my son. You put your hand on my daughter, Salvatore, while she lay helpless. That act cost you your life, your legacy, and your entire syndicate," Arthur said, his expression utterly detached. "Honor is not a currency, you understand, but retribution is a lesson you will learn." Sal raised his weapon, the desperation making his movements sloppy. "Come closer, old man. I'll take you with me." Before Sal could fully aim, one of Arthur's specialists, moving with the practiced efficiency of a trained operative, fired a single, precise shot. The round hit Sal's elbow, shattering the joint and sending the pistol clattering harmlessly away onto the wet concrete. Sal screamed, clutching the mangled limb. Arthur Callahan approached the crippled crime boss. He looked down at Salvatore Messina, the ruthless head of the city's most dominant syndicate, now reduced to a whimpering mess on the floor of a filthy alley. "The war ends now," Arthur decreed. "The syndicate is dissolved. Your assets are seized. Your people are neutralized." He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod to Harris. Harris didn't use a specialized operative this time. He took a heavy-duty bolt cutter from a nearby operational crate. "As for you," Arthur continued, turning his back, walking away from the scene of finality, "you violated the most sacred trust. You struck her near the cradle. You will disappear completely, without a trace, without a body, without a legacy. Only one family survives this carnage." The metallic snap of the bolt cutter was the last distinct sound before Arthur J. Callahan stepped back into the shadows. Days later, St. Jude's Mercy Hospital was quiet again. Evie had been moved from the metropolitan center to a small private facility hundreds of miles away, accompanied by a small, dedicated staff of nurses and formidable security detail. The name Messina was erased from her life, replaced by an unsettling, profound peace. Arthur Callahan arrived, finally, for a visit that wasn't dictated by crisis management. He didn't wear a suit. He wore quiet civilian clothes. He looked exhausted, but the piercing blue eyes had regained their steady calm. He watched Evelyn Harper, 24, hold his grandson. The baby was oblivious to the systemic destruction his birth had catalyzed. Evie, though still bearing a faint bruise on her cheek, looked less haunted. The resilience was winning. Arthur sat by the bedside, reaching out only to grasp Evie's hand. "It's over, Evie," he said softly, simply. "All of it." "What did you do, Dad?" she whispered, knowing the answer was far beyond the scope of local law enforcement. "I built an empire on the assumption that I would never have to dismantle someone else's," Arthur J. Callahan, 55, admitted. "But when a man threatens my bloodline, when he violates my child in a place of recovery, reason is suspended. I told him, total war. And total war requires a complete victory." He squeezed her hand gently. The sophisticated man of influence had won, not by fighting fire with fire, but by deploying a calculated cold devastation that the volatile criminal mind of Salvatore Messina could never have comprehended. The ironclad district was now quiet, the Syndicate a memory, its remnants scattered and neutralized. Arthur leaned in, speaking in a low, protective tone. "You and the boy are safe, permanently. We can finally start rebuilding, not just our lives, but your peace." Evelyn Harper looked from her father to her child, realizing that the horrific act committed in that sterile hospital room had not broken her, but had unleashed a force that had cleansed her world entirely, setting the stage for a future where the names Messina and organized crime were nothing more than echoes of a forgotten violence. The bloody carnage was complete, and only the Callahan family remained standing, protected by the uncompromising vengeance of a father who never tolerated a challenge to his familial honor. The ironclad district, usually a symphony of industrial grind, the clang of steel, the diesel fumes, the distant muffled shouting, fell into an unnatural, suffocating quiet. Arthur's Phase 2, the neutralization effort, was less about noise and more about surgical silence, cutting the heart out of Salvatore's operation without tearing the outer skin. The loss of communication was the first paralyzing blow. With the encrypted satellite phones and secure landlines gone, Messina's sprawling network folded inward, unable to receive commands, unable to report losses. Salvatore, huddled in his reinforced bunker beneath the primary ironclad compound, felt the silence as if it were physical pressure on his eardrums. He had always ruled through volume and visibility. Arthur was erasing him through subtraction. "We need eyes on the docks," Sal bellowed at his remaining men, a group of maybe 20, all veterans, but now looking pale and confused. "Why can't anyone reach the East End crew? We need to know who is doing this." One of his captains, Marco, nervously shifted his weight. "Boss, the lines are down, like everywhere. It's not a cut line, Sal. It's systematic. And the warehouse, the one near the rail yard, it's gone. Burned to the ground, nothing left but smoke and melted steel. Witnesses say they saw specialized vans, unmarked. They didn't look like cops. They didn't look like rivals. They looked like money," Sal snarled, running a hand through his sweat-slicked hair. He finally understood the difference between fighting a street war and fighting an organized, systematic response backed by the kind of wealth that bought silence and military precision. He had assumed Arthur was an accountant, a political manipulator. He was realizing Arthur was a general. Arthur, miles away at the old Hawthorne estate, watched the operational maps. The glowing red dots representing Messina's enforcement hubs were blinking off one by one, replaced by a cool, clean blue indicating neutralized. "Report on the personnel status, Harris," Arthur ordered, his eyes never leaving the display. Harris, meticulous as ever, read from the updated Callahan ledger data. 42 high-value personnel secured. They weren't harmed, merely disarmed and detained in the temporary holding facilities outside the metropolitan zone. "No casualties on our side, Mr. Callahan, clean sweep." Arthur nodded slowly. His campaign was not driven by simple bloodlust but by eradication. Killing Sal's soldiers would create martyrs and attract unnecessary police scrutiny. Neutering them, removing them from the board entirely, left Sal utterly isolated and exposed. Phase 2 was designed to make Sal feel the walls closing in, not by attack, but by disappearance. The enforcers vanished, the money evaporated, the lines of control snapped. The ironclad district was becoming a trap, meticulously set. "The objective remains," Arthur stated, tapping a pencil against the map focused on Sal's central compound. "We eliminate his capacity to retaliate. We ensure he has 0 operational personnel, 0 financial viability, and 0 communication with the outside world. He must understand that the ground he stands on is dissolving beneath him." The violation committed against Evie had been profoundly personal, and Arthur's retribution, though clinically delivered, was fundamentally driven by that wound. Messina's physical violence against a recovering woman was an affront to Arthur's deeply held old-world concept of honor, and Arthur's retaliation would be a complete, total, and permanent dismemberment of everything Salvatore possessed. In the ironclad district, the pressure intensified. Salvatore was losing men not to combat, but to fear and attrition. He sent out 3 separate teams to try and break the communication blackout. All 3 vanished into the labyrinthine alleys, never reporting back. They weren't captured by police or rivals. They were swallowed whole by Arthur's network, sequestered in anonymous locations, their phones jammed, their existence momentarily suspended. Sal's paranoia spiked. He started seeing Arthur's cold logic in every shadow, every unexpected silence. Arthur wasn't fighting a street war. He was performing an exorcism on Sal's life. "He is trying to break me," Sal muttered to Marco, staring wide-eyed at a surveillance monitor showing only static. "He thinks he can squeeze me until I choke. We need to move, boss. The supply lines are cut. We're running low on power, food, and ammo. We need to breach the ironclad perimeter tonight." Sal shook his head, a wild glint in his eyes. He realized he had lost the external fight. He had lost his district, his money, and his men. But Arthur, despite his cold efficiency, had a glaring weakness: Evie and the child. "No, we don't run," Sal decided, his voice raspy. "We hit the heart. We remind Callahan what real leverage is." He pulled out a discarded, untraceable burner phone, a relic he only used for the most sensitive, desperate situations. He punched in a series of numbers, connecting to a distant cousin, a low-level operator Arthur's sweep hadn't deemed important enough to neutralize. "I need a team," Sal hissed into the phone. "5 cars, non-Messina personnel. I need quiet, fast access to St. Jude's, the North Wing. I need the girl and the baby. Tell them high-risk, double pay now." The desperation of the move was clear. Arthur had planned for sophisticated warfare. Sal was resorting to barbaric kidnapping, seeking protection behind the innocence he had just threatened. Arthur, constantly anticipating, had already foreseen this panicked pivot. He knew the criminal mind defaulted to taking hostages when cornered. The protection detail around Evie and the baby at St. Jude's Mercy Hospital was already doubled, composed of silent professional security specialists, men who didn't look like guards, but whose training eclipsed any typical hospital security force. Harris brought Arthur the news of the unusual activity. "We intercepted chatter, Mr. Low-level operators, non-Messina connections, mobilizing outside the ironclad district. They are heading towards St." Arthur stood abruptly, the only visible flicker of emotion crossing his face, a brief spasm of pure, cold, paternal fear. "Messina is going for the child," Arthur deduced, not asking a question. "He believes my vengeance is contingent on the safety of the boy. He is tragically mistaken." Arthur walked to the weapons cabinet concealed behind the bookshelf, but stopped before opening it. He did not need a weapon to control this situation. He needed his voice and his presence. "Contact the team surrounding St. Tell them to allow the first wave through the outer perimeter, but neutralize them before they enter the building structure. I want Messina cut off from his escape route and his leverage simultaneously. He is to be convinced in real time that his final desperate gambit has failed." "And Sal himself, sir?" Harris asked, recognizing the shift in protocol. "He will not be allowed to leave the ironclad district alive or free," Arthur stated. "He will learn in his final moments that when you strike my family, you burn your world to the ground for the privilege. Mobilize the final team. I want the immediate perimeter of his bunker secured. Let him think he has time to escape, then crush the opportunity." The coordinated attack on Sal's desperate convoy was executed with brutal efficiency 20 minutes later. The hastily assembled team of mercenaries, motivated only by money and oblivious to the scale of Arthur's operation, were ambushed miles from the hospital. The interception was instantaneous, silent, and decisive. Sal, relying on their signal, waited anxiously in his bunker. When the burner phone rang, Sal snatched it up, expecting confirmation that his leverage was secured. Instead, a synthesized voice devoid of human inflection played a recording, the frantic dying gasps of the mercenary captain, followed by the sound of glass shattering and metal tearing. Then, silence. Sal slammed the phone down, his face pale with shock. He had failed. Arthur had anticipated his panic and neutralized his escape plan before it even reached the starting line. He's playing with me, Sal whispered, the arrogant volatility replaced by naked terror. He is systematically taking everything, and now he is just waiting for me to break. He looked around his opulent bunker, the marble, the dark wood, the ridiculous heavy gold jewelry on his fingers. It all felt like the decor of a mausoleum. Marco, we move. Now, get every weapon we have. We break through the perimeter. We go east, towards the river. Now before he seals the walls completely, the final confrontation was the climax of Arthur's controlled rage, a meticulous execution that ensured Salvatore met his end on the terms dictated by the violated familial honor. They didn't make it 50 yards. The alleyway was a canyon of brick and shadow, narrow and choked with industrial detritus. As they rounded a corner beneath the fire escape, they ran directly into the final organized deployment of Arthur's internal security team. This team was different. These weren't the clinical operatives who neutralized the finances. These were the enforcers of Arthur's personal code, men who moved with quiet purpose, utilizing non-standard tactics perfected in conflict zones far from metropolitan America. The exchange of gunfire was deafening but brief. Sal's men, exhausted, panicked, and lacking central coordination, were immediately overwhelmed. Arthur's team targeted incapacitation, using specialized subsonic rounds designed to break bone and disable movement without immediate fatality. The goal was simple: ensure Salvatore survived long enough to witness his total destruction. Within 90 seconds, the only man left standing was Salvatore Messina, bleeding heavily from 3 distinct wounds, his custom-tailored linen suit ruined, the gold jewelry catching the weak light of a broken street lamp. He was pinned down, breathing raggedly, behind an overturned barrel. He heard footsteps approaching, slow, deliberate, echoing in the confined space. "Show yourself, Callahan," Sal screamed, clutching his last pistol, his hand shaking uncontrollably. "Come and finish it yourself, you coward." Arthur J. Callahan emerged from the darkness of a massive, defunct loading dock. He was impeccably dressed, despite the setting, and entirely unarmed. Harris and 2 of Arthur's senior security specialists flanked him, keeping their weapons holstered, acting only as silent witnesses to their employer's final decree. Arthur looked down at the scene of carnage, the broken men, the discarded weapons, the smell of cordite and spilled blood. He looked past the destruction to the man responsible for the unforgivable sin committed in St. Jude's Mercy Hospital. "I'm not a coward, Salvatore," Arthur said, his voice ringing with chilling authority in the alley. "I am a man who maintains distance from filth. You, however, forced proximity." Sal laughed, a hollow, guttural sound of hysterical desperation. "Filth? You think you're better than me? You declared total war over a slap. A slap, in the grand scheme, it's nothing. We settle these things." "We settle nothing, Salvatore," Arthur corrected, stepping closer, ignoring the pistol Sal weakly aimed in his general direction. "That slap was the measure of your lack of restraint, your ultimate violation of the sanctity of my family. It showed me that you believed you possessed power greater than mine, simply because you held a temporary advantage over a vulnerable woman recovering from the immense trauma of childbirth. You desecrated her recovery. You threatened my grandson." Arthur stopped perhaps 10 feet from the barrel. His blue eyes were piercing, absolute. "That act was a declaration of war on fundamental honor, and you should have known I value honor more than life itself. When you placed your hands on Evelyn, you signed the death warrant of your entire lineage." Sal tried to raise the pistol, his fingers slick with blood. "If I die, I take you down with me, old man. I swear it." Arthur nodded to the specialist on his right. The operative moved with blinding speed. It wasn't a gunshot, it was a quick, precise movement. Sal's remaining wrist was twisted sharply, a clinical break that elicited a sickening crack and a piercing scream from Sal. The pistol fell to the oil-stained concrete. Now truly helpless, Salvatore Messina could only stare up at Arthur, the fear finally overwhelming the volatile arrogance. "The systematic destruction of your syndicate is complete, Salvatore," Arthur pronounced, the words delivering a final, definitive judgment. "The Ledger House is ash. Your communication grid is silent. Your personnel are neutralized and dispersed. You have no money, no network, no name. The entire structure you spent your life building is gone, in less than 48 hours. Arthur paused, allowing the gravity of the total loss to sink into Sal's mind. "You asked for war. I provided extinction. I cannot allow a man who commits such an unforgivable act to remain a threat." You are a cancer, Salvatore, and I perform surgery with finality. Arthur did not linger. He turned his back on the broken crime boss. Harris, ensure the execution of the final contingency. No body, no trace. No martyr. The name Messina ends tonight, and every scrap of evidence linking this operation to the Callahan family is to be purged immediately. Harris gave a single, solemn nod. Understood, Mr. The metallic snap of the heavy-duty bolt cutter, the same tool that had been introduced as part of the initial operational gear, was heard once more, followed by a sound that was immediately muffled and quickly silenced. Arthur walked away, his stride composed. The war was over. The promise of total war had been delivered, absolute devastation and the complete eradication of the threat. The city woke up to a mystery. News reports speculated wildly about a sudden, violent internal collapse in the ironclad district, a catastrophic internal feud, perhaps federal intervention or maybe a rival syndicate moving in with unprecedented force. Whatever the explanation, the Messina Syndicate was no more. Operations ceased globally. Their real estate was seized by anonymous holding companies. Their leaders disappeared without a whisper. The systematic whirlwind had concluded. Meanwhile, 3 days after the final confrontation, Evelyn and her newborn child were settled into their new life. St. Jude's Mercy Hospital was a distant, horrific memory. Arthur had established them in a meticulously secured residential estate deep in the Pacific Northwest, secluded, opulent, and guarded by personnel who now understood the uncompromising nature of their employer's protective instincts. Evie sat in the nursery, the room bathed in soft, filtered sunlight. The bruise on her cheek was fading, transforming from a badge of pain to a mark of the resilience that had survived the storm. She held her son, now peaceful and robust, and felt the return of a profound, unburdened safety she hadn't known since Sal first entered her life. Arthur arrived for his first extended stay. He looked truly exhausted, the stress of coordinating the annihilation visible in the deep lines around his piercing blue eyes. He walked into the nursery and saw his daughter, whole and safe, and his grandson, the reason for the chaos and the subsequent cleansing. He approached Evie, laying a gentle hand on her shoulder. "How are you feeling, Evie?" he asked, the formality of the magnate replaced by the quiet concern of a father. Evie looked up at him. She knew what he had done, though she only possessed the broad strokes. She knew that the man who had terrified her, who had violated her in her weakest moment, was gone, erased from existence with the terrifying precision only her father could muster. "I feel safe, Dad." Finally. But the extent of it. She trailed off, trying to reconcile the elegant man before her with the architect of total war. "When you lay in that hospital bed, Evie, stripped of all defenses, and that brute placed his hand on you, he fundamentally misread the world," Arthur explained, his voice low and educational, as if teaching a harsh lesson in geopolitics. He assumed boundaries could be crossed with impunity. I taught him that crossing the line of familial sanctity means the annihilation of the transgressor. There is no middle ground, no negotiation when it involves my bloodline. He leaned back, the image of the destroyed ironclad district and the final brutal silence of the alleyway momentarily shadowing his eyes. Total war is not a negotiation tool, Evie. It is a commitment to the permanent removal of a threat. If I had simply crippled him, he would have returned. If I had sent him to prison, he would have operated from within. He had to be erased entirely, structurally and physically. Only then is the peace genuine. Evie looked down at her son, then back up at her father. She recognized the chilling, unwavering capacity for retribution that lay beneath the tailored suits and the sophisticated demeanor. It was terrifying, yes, but it was also the ultimate form of protection. "So, it is truly over?" she asked, seeking absolute confirmation. "The carnage is complete," Arthur confirmed. "The Messina Syndicate is dissolved. The financial records are sanitized. The operational history is buried. You and the boy are protected by an operational network that understands its only function is to ensure your uninterrupted safety. The cost was high, the methods brutal, but the result is definitive." Arthur smiled slightly, a gentle, tired expression. "We rebuild now, Evie. We focus on the future, on the boy. You will never have to look over your shoulder again. That world is gone, replaced by the peace I purchased with absolute vengeance." He reached out, allowing his grandson to grasp his finger. The child, oblivious to the seismic violence unleashed on his behalf, squeezed tight. Evelyn Harper looked at her father, Arthur J. He was not merely a protective figure. He was a force of elemental retribution who had purged her world entirely. The assault in the hospital room, intended to humble her, had instead secured her absolute, unwavering sanctuary. The conflict was resolved, the debt paid in full, and the Callahan family stood alone, protected by the systematic devastation of total war. The silence that followed Arthur's departure from the alley was thick and absolute, a tangible absence of sound that tasted of dust and cold, spilled metal. Harris stepped forward, his face impassive, professionalism overriding any human reaction to the scene of sudden, violent dismemberment. Arthur had declared the war finished, but the final phase, the complete erasure, was Harris' responsibility. "The contingency is activated," Harris murmured into a secure wrist communicator, his voice barely audible. He didn't look at the broken form of Salvatore. Phase 4. Systematic decontamination. 0 footprint. 0 residue. This location is to be sterilized in 30 minutes. No trace of Messina's existence remains by sunrise. The operatives moved with chilling efficiency. They were not cleanup crew. They were specialists in disappearance. Sal's remains, along with every cartridge casing, every drop of blood that couldn't be dissolved by the specialized solvents, were meticulously gathered. The goal was not merely to hide a murder, but to eliminate a memory. Arthur required historical revisionism. Salvatore Messina had not been killed. He had simply ceased to exist, swallowed by the sheer structural collapse of his own enterprise. The Callahan ledger, resting securely on Arthur's mahogany desk back at the old Hawthorne estate, was already being updated in real time. The entries for the Messina Syndicate, once sprawling and complex, were being systematically deleted, not through physical erasure, but through complex financial maneuvers that redistributed assets into untouchable offshore trusts, ensuring that the wealth did not simply vanish, but became an untraceable fuel source for Arthur's newly fortified security architecture. Harris remained in the ironclad district for another hour, watching the systemic purge. The 12 incapacitated Messina men, currently sedated and tied securely in specialized vans, were driven hundreds of miles away to remote, non-extradition locations where they would be released, stripped of identity, money, and means, too isolated and terrified to ever speak of the destruction they had witnessed. They were not threats anymore. They were ghosts. This was the final layer of Arthur's vengeance, making sure the enemy's witnesses could never converge, could never pool their information to reconstruct the picture of what had happened. Total war meant not just eliminating the leader, but scattering the fragments of the organization so widely they could never coalesce. Only when the alley was clean, the air still and the first grey hints of dawn began to touch the jagged skylines of the industrial core, did Harris finally signal the end of the operation. He used the encrypted satellite phone, the same device Arthur had used to declare the war, to send a single final coded message. Resolution achieved. Theater secured. Meanwhile, the transition for Evie was abrupt, a violent displacement from vulnerability to impenetrable fortress. The drive from St. Jude's Mercy Hospital had been executed under absolute security, a ghost motorcade moving silently through the night, bypassing standard routes and surveillance points. Evie was heavily medicated. The trauma of the birth, the terror of Sal's attack, and the dizzying speed of her father's retribution blurring together into a toxic cocktail of anxiety and relief. The old Hawthorne estate was a contradiction. It was old money, sprawling and built to withstand a siege, yet inside it had been meticulously sterilized and updated for maximum comfort and security. It sat nestled in a heavily wooded mountainous region, miles from any main road, shielded by layers of land ownership and sophisticated invisible technology. Evie woke up in a bed that felt like silk and clouds, the air crisp and clean, smelling of pine and polished wood, a stark contrast to the antiseptic sting of St. Jude's. The first few days were a haze. She existed in a state of hypervigilance, waiting for the shoe to drop, waiting for the inevitable retaliation that in her old, fragile world always followed a major crime. But the retaliation never came. Only silence. The only noise was the soft, rhythmic breathing of her son, who slept peacefully in the adjacent bassinet, guarded by the silent presence of 2 women introduced simply as nurses. though their demeanor and physical build suggested they were far more proficient with advanced protection protocols than with pediatric care. Her mind struggled to harmonize two conflicting realities: the father who sat patiently beside her, discussing classical literature and the logistics of the estate's organic garden, and the architect of extinction who had just dismantled a global crime network in 48 hours. On the third evening, Arthur returned from the city, not triumphant but profoundly weary. He had changed out of his city suit and into casual cashmere, yet the exhaustion beneath his piercing blue eyes remained. He found Evie in the grand high-ceilinged library, the heart of the estate, trying to read a novel but mostly staring out the massive leaded glass window at the impenetrable darkness of the surrounding forest. "Evie," he said softly, sitting opposite her. The heavy oak door automatically slid shut behind him, sealing them in. Evie placed the book down. "It's quiet, Dad. Too quiet." Arthur acknowledged the observation with a grave nod. "That is the sound of absolute security, my dear. The noise you're used to, the fear, the surveillance, the uncertainty, that was the sound of compromise. This silence is the sound of permanent, comprehensive safety." "I know what you did," Evie said, her voice strained. She looked away, towards the massive fireplace, the flames dancing merrily, oblivious to the carnage that secured their warmth. "Harris updated me on the resolution." She couldn't bring herself to say murder or killing. Arthur waited patiently. He knew this conversation was inevitable and necessary. He had to ensure that while she understood the brutality, she also understood the necessity. "Tell me, Evie, what is your reading of the situation? I know Sal had to be stopped. I know he was coming for us again, but the scale. 48 hours, Dad. You erased him. You erased the name, the network, the money. It feels total. It feels like you didn't just win a fight. You wiped the slate clean." Arthur leaned forward, his hands folded neatly on his knees. "That is precisely the point, Evie, and I need you to understand why. In our world, in the world of influence and power, there is a fundamental difference between engaging in conflict and declaring total war. Conflict allows for surrender, negotiation, and future threat assessment. Total war does not. Total war is the systematic process of elimination until the aggressor is incapable of breathing the same air as the protected party." He paused, letting the clinical cruelty of the statement settle. "When Sal struck you in that hospital bed, he committed an act of aggression that was unforgivable, not because of the physical pain, though that was profound, but because of the violation of sanctity. He demonstrated that he was willing to use you, recovering and vulnerable, as a tool of psychological dominance against me. He believed my commitment to family was a weakness he could exploit." Arthur's blue eyes were cold and focused. "I demonstrated that my commitment to family is the most destructive force on the continent. I cannot afford the luxury of a prisoner, an exile, or a surviving relative with a grudge. Sal had to be structurally destroyed so that no one, for generations, would ever look at a member of the Callahan family and see an opportunity for leverage again." Evie absorbed the explanation, tracing patterns on the expensive rug with her toe. "And the people, the men you detained, the ones you didn't kill. They were resources, Evie, not enemies," Arthur clarified. "They were instruments of Sal's will. They are now dispersed, isolated, and have been given sufficient incentive to remain silent for the rest of their lives. They know I can reach them anywhere. They will live the remainder of their existence as non-persons. They are no longer a threat. The goal was eradication, not mass casualty. That would have brought unwanted scrutiny." He looked around the magnificent library, the embodiment of his accumulated power and meticulous planning. "This estate, these defenses, the peace you feel right now, this was purchased by the absolute certainty that the enemy is gone, not contained. Gone." Evie felt a shiver, not of fear of her father, but of the awe of his capacity. She saw not just a father, but a necessary monster created purely for her defense. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked, the question escaping before she could stop it. "The cost? The sheer scale of the operation." Arthur rose and walked to the fireplace, gazing into the flames. His posture was rigid, the weight of the previous 72 hours heavy upon him. "Regret is a luxury afforded to those who have the option of doing nothing, Evie. I had no such option. When a man strikes a woman recovering from the immense physical and emotional trauma of bringing my grandson into this world, there is no negotiation, only reaction. My only regret," Arthur continued, turning back to face her, is that I allowed him proximity to you in the first place, believing his volatility could be managed with money and distance. He walked over to her chair and knelt down, a rare gesture of intimacy. He took her hands, his touch warm and firm. You are safe. Your son is safe. This security is total. It is definitive. The war I declared was not a skirmish. It was a purification. No surviving enemy will ever challenge the sanctity of this line again. The name Messina is now a cautionary tale whispered only in the highest, most paranoid circles of the world, a symbol of what happens when you violate a boundary established by total force. Evie looked into his tired, resolute face. She had witnessed something few ever understood, the transformation of financial power into strategic, targeted military-grade retribution. Her father, the magnate, had revealed himself to be a king prepared to burn down an entire kingdom to protect his heir. So what now? She asked, seeking the blueprint for the peace. Now, we live, Arthur stated simply, standing up. We teach the boy the value of honor and restraint, lessons his biological father never learned. We ensure that this sanctuary remains just that. The operational infrastructure remains intact, running silently beneath our lives. Every communication, every visitor, every movement of capital is filtered through a system designed to detect even the faintest ripple of a threat. The war may be over, but the vigilance is permanent. He gestured towards the nursery door. Go check on the boy, Evie. Hold him. This is what we fought for. This is the peace that was required. Evie stood, feeling lighter than she had in weeks. The weight of Salvatore, the omnipresent shadow of his possessive rage, was finally irrevocably lifted. Her father had not simply provided security. He had provided a clean break from history. Days folded into weeks at the old Hawthorne estate. The city chatter, the anonymous whispers of the ironclad district's spectacular collapse, faded into background noise, replaced by the mundane, rhythmic beauty of raising a newborn in absolute safety. Arthur, though present, began the arduous process of untangling his own financial and political exposure from the necessary chaos of the war. Harris provided updates, quiet affirmations that the erasure was holding firm. The Callahan ledger was now a testament not just to Arthur's wealth, but to his capacity for systemic destruction. Every numbered account was balanced, every operational asset hidden. One afternoon, Arthur sat alone in his study, reviewing the final accounting of the operation. The costs were astronomical, measured in billions of liquidated assets, specialized personnel payroll, and the quiet bribing necessary to ensure every investigating agency turned a blind eye simultaneously. He used the encrypted satellite phone one last time, contacting a network of high-level government contacts, men who owed him long-dormant favors, stretching back decades. The restructuring is complete, Arthur said into the phone, his voice low and firm. The entire network has been contained and dispersed. The threat is fully neutralized. I require absolute assurance that the public narrative remains consistent. Internal collapse. I want the history of the Messina family to read as a self-inflicted wound. The response was immediate and obsequious. Arthur listened for a moment, then simply terminated the connection. The phone, the symbol of the declaration of war, was then methodically disassembled and destroyed, its components scattered across 3 continents. Arthur leaned back, staring at a landscape painting, a vast, serene mountain range, untouched and permanent. He had acted not out of emotion alone, but out of a calculating necessity that acknowledged the unique danger Sal represented. Volatility coupled with power was unacceptable when it touched his lineage. He stood, finally shedding the last vestiges of the wartime commander. The sophistication, the tailored elegance, and the meticulous planning that defined him were now redirected entirely towards maintenance of the peace. He walked toward the nursery. Evie was rocking the baby, singing a soft, unfamiliar lullaby. She looked up, the exhaustion replaced by a deep, settled calm. The fading bruise on her cheek was almost invisible now, but Arthur saw it clearly, the scar of the transgression that had fueled his vengeance. Evie watched her father approach, recognizing the profound change in him. The war had cost him, aged him slightly, but it had also solidified his resolve into something unbreakable. He is sleeping soundly, Evie whispered, adjusting the blanket. He should, Arthur replied, his voice soft. He has a great deal of time ahead of him, time earned through great expense. "You won, Dad," Evie stated, the finality of the statement hanging in the peaceful air. "You didn't just win the battle, you finished the game. When total war is declared—" "Evie," Arthur said, his eyes resting on his daughter, "then on the child there is no surviving winner, only the protected and the permanently removed. I executed the process required to ensure your survival and the security of this family, and in doing so, I settled a debt of honor that superseded every financial, political, or legal constraint. The sanctuary is absolute." He placed a gentle hand on her head, a silent benediction. The immediate aftermath of the violence was the deepest, most pervasive peace Evie had ever known. The city outside, confused and rebuilding, was forced to accept the fabricated narrative of Sal Messina's self-destruction. Arthur Callahan had returned to his life as the quiet, influential magnate, his hands clean, his family secured behind impenetrable walls of wealth and strategic ruthlessness. The unforgivable act in St. Jude's Mercy Hospital had purchased their absolute, unchallengeable future. The carnage was complete, the silence permanent. Smash that like button, then hit subscribe.